Grace, mercy, and peace belong to you. They are free gifts from the one who was and is to come. I can relate to the Old Testament story that Mary Lou read to you. Melinda and I both can, because we are hip deep in probate right now. Once her mother passed, we're finding out all sorts of things that we didn't want to know about the finances. And where there is a corollary to Murphy's Law that says, where things are simple, a lawyer will come along and screw things up beyond belief. And so we're talking to lawyers and talking to financiers and trying to untangle a bunch of Gordian knots of titles and loans and various things to find out if there actually is an estate to divide up. And this brings us to our story with Jacob and Esau. Now, there are a lot of layers to this one little story. There's prophecy. There's dysfunctional families. There's sibling rivalries. In fact, if you took this whole Jacob and Esau saga, you could probably turn it into a sitcom called Everybody Loves Jacob. Because that's the way it seems to go. Jacob manages to weasel his way into everything that is supposed to come to Esau. Now, you have this birthright, which by right goes to the oldest son. And you see right away, even as the birth is taking place, Jacob's trying to get a free ride out of the womb by grabbing onto Esau and grabbing onto his foot. And it just continues from there. Well, anyway, the two yield to different parents. Jacob is mama's boy, mama's favorite. Esau is daddy's little man. He's my boy who goes out hunting in the woods. Now, Isaac and Esau could probably that era's version of Duck Dynasty. These are the guys, we're hunting men. Arr, 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 arr. Manly men hunt and go out for game and eat wild critters. Meanwhile, Jacob and Mama sit around all day around the tent plotting. And here you see another plot taking place. So one day, Esau's out hunting. And apparently it wasn't a good day on the hunt, because Esau comes back hungry. And here's Jacob cooking away. Cooking a pot of what we call out in my part of Illinois, chowder. Or in Kentucky, they might call it burgoo. Now here comes Esau. Food. I'm hungry. And Esau comes off like a little kid through all of this. And Jacob, ever the exploiter, sees his chance, go, okay, you want some food, do ya? Well, why don't you give me your part of the inheritance, and I'll give you a bowl of stew. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like too good of a bargain if you're Esau. Esau apparently was not the sharpest crayon in the drawer. And Esau's going, oh, what good is an inheritance if I'm going to die of hunger? Okay, give me the stew. And so Esau gives away his inheritance for a bowl of stew. Allow one little meal. And it's lentil stew. Lentil stew's not that great to begin with. I mean, I'd have at least demanded a steak out of the deal. Seriously, steak, potato, full buffet. But so Esau despised his birthright. And in a sense, despised and disrespected the father who was going to give it to him. So let's look at this in our time, in our eyes. First off, what is a birthright? Under the Jewish system of that time, the Hebrew system, which by the way is patriarchal, women got the shaft all the way through. If you were a woman in that society and you wanted to get rich, you pretty much had to marry into it. I'm sorry. And it was just how it rolled back then. But the firstborn son got a double portion of the inheritance and the property. As the firstborn son of Abraham, he was heir to not only the physical promises, a double portion of the land, twice as much as Jacob was going to get, twice as much of all the cattle, livestock, etc. But God had made several promises to Abraham, which, as Abraham's grandson, Esau would have been in line to get. Esau would have been the one to inherit the promises of father of many nations, and so forth. There was no probate in the Old Testament. You didn't have to argue about this. That's the way it was. If you remember the story of the prodigal son, that's basically what he asked for. He goes, I want my birthright, but I want it now. Esau gave it away. Gave it away after being exploited by Jacob. Now let's point, neither one of these two are particularly the hero in this one. Jacob's a sneak. He's an exploiter. Let's just put it bluntly, he's a weasel. And Esau was a whiner. All he thought about was his belly and living in the now. Whatever he wanted now, the future didn't matter. So what does this mean to us? What is our birthright as Christians? What is our inheritance? And let's think about what this birthright would be as a series of concentric circles. Right in the middle, the bullseye. Humanity. What rights do we have? What have we inherited just by virtue of being a human being? We were made in God's image. We were loved by God. We are inheritors of God's grace that He gives to each and every one of us. And note, if we deem anyone, another person, as unworthy of God's love and God's grace, we're despising our own birthright. Because the grace God gives to us, the grace that allows us to come to God, to follow God in the first place, is spread abroad to everybody, regardless of race, creed, color, gender, socioeconomic status, etc., 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 etc. If we are people, we all have that in common as children of God. Next step out. Christians. We have received a special measure of God's grace. In Romans 8, which was another one of our lectionary passages that we didn't read, Paul starts out saying there is no condemnation for those of Christ Jesus. None. Nada. Nunca. Zilch. God does not condemn us. The penalty of sin and death has been taken from us. We are heirs of spiritual life and righteousness in God. God sees us through the lens of Jesus. What does this mean for us as members of St. John Church and members of the United Church of Christ? There is a historical legacy, a very rich one if you really go back into the history. looking at the Pilgrims, Jonathan Edwards, Charles Finney, the Germans that came to the Midwest, trying to get their own little bit of religious freedom from a state church back in Prussia, where they decided to do their own merger, and you're all one church now. But they came to the Midwest and the Mid-South seeking a new life and farmland and the promises of the new world. And they brought that Reformed religion with them. Look at the Pilgrim from the second they hit Plymouth Rock. They were all about freedom from day one. As our record to our Native American show, we weren't always the most consistent in how we lived that out, but we were about freedom. The John Winthrop that said, God hath still more light to break forth from God's holy word. That's the still speaking God right from day one. We have a heritage of giving an extravagant welcome to everyone, out of that idea that we are people created in God's image. We try not to discriminate. Again, not always the most consistent, but we're working at it, because God is starting to show us that we all are created in God's image, and we need to treat each other as such. So we welcome everyone, regardless of who you are. Inheritances and birthrights are only good insofar as they are used. Only good as much as they are shared, not tightly grasped. But case in point, a fellow down in Louisiana named Boudreaux. Now, Boudreaux, as you can guess from the name, was a Cajun, and a rather stingy Cajun at that. He had managed, through his stinginess and penny pinching, Jack Benny had nothing on him, to amass quite a bit of wealth. And the only real thing he spent that wealth on was just enough to marry the prettiest girl in New Orleans, Marie. And they lived a long marriage together. Not the happiest, since once he got Marie, he wasn't as generous as he used to be before. But they had a good life. They lived well. Well, finally, as it comes to all people, Boudreaux died. But he left in his will the provision that he wanted all his money to be buried with him. I'll work for that money. I own that money. I want to be buried with me. And so everybody in that Cajun community was sitting there thinking, is she really going to bury that money with him? So the day of the funeral comes. And there's old Boudreaux in the casket. Pine box, mind you, because he wasn't going to spend any more money on himself after he died than before. And Marie and Marie's best friend Claudette, and pretty much everybody else in the community wanting to make sure that all the people that Boudreaux had pinched pennies and exploited wanted to make sure that he really was dead and wasn't going to try to chisel him out of any more cash. Well, here comes Marie, and she walks down the center aisle of the chapel with a small box. And she walks slowly down and places it in the casket, then turns around, sits down at her seat next to Claudette. And Claudette looks at her and says, Marie, surely you did not go through with that silly idea of Boudreaux's about burying all his money with him. Well, Marie goes, well, yes and no. You can obviously see from that casket I wasn't going to get all of that money in there. So what I did, I needed advice. So I went down to First National Bank and I talked to the banker. Well, the banker said the thing to do would be to set up a checking account. So I put all the money into a checking account. And then I wrote a check out to Boudreaux for the balance of the account. That's what I put in the box. Now, if Boudreaux can cash that check, he can have the money. And so it is with us. We share our birthright. We share our inheritance with the people we meet. We share what God has given us with them and share a little bit of God and the grace of Jesus with them. We have an open door to everybody. Let us focus on that grace and extend it. Because the parables Jesus told show that the more God's people extend and invest our inheritance in others, the more our spiritual wealth grows. Shalom and amen.